brothers and sisters. So welcome to day 2 of our talk about spiritual warfare and the discernment of spirits. And so I'm going to be using a book for these days to guide us. I don't believe in reinventing the wheel, and many of you in Heartreach who have journeyed through a lot of these talks before realize that I find it very helpful to use really good books and good sources of wisdom of people far beyond on the spiritual life than myself, who have gained and gleaned a great wisdom to share with us from the saints or from their personal experiences. I'll add my own kind of 2 cents to things as we go along, or just will be presenting it in my own words and through my own experience too in some ways. And so, but I want to just say that I'm really excited that the book I'm going to be using is this book called Spiritual Warfare and Discernment of Spirits by Dan Burke. A really awesome book. It's produced by Spiritual Direction Series by the Sophia Institute Press. And so just for some of you, a little bit of background on Dan Burke and his wife Stephanie Burke. They have been huge centers of renewal of the church in the States and throughout the world, that is spreading through the mission of the Avila Institute, which Dan Burke founded and which was greatly influenced too by Dr. Anthony Lillis and so many others, to provide programs at the Institute to train people in the faith, especially to access the deep mystical traditions on prayer and spiritual theology, so that by studying we would the deep richness of our faith, that our hearts would be formed and burn and be able to have the content and the wisdom and the light in our minds to move forward in the spiritual life. And study and spiritual reading is essential to progress in the spiritual life. So this institute has done amazing work and in the formation of seminarians and priests and raising up an Avila army, as they say, of really spiritually hungry people, because it's a deep contemplative revolution that will change the church and change the world. People who have deep contact with God in prayer become vessels of light and grace throughout the world. And you know, Father Hegarty, who writes many books, he speaks about this contemplative revolution in his book Contemplative Hunger, and he speaks about right now there's in the church there's a generation of laity rising up with deep hunger for prayer and contemplation. And please God, that will be the renewal of the church, because they will then become homes from which priests and religious then will come in the future too, which will bring a whole nother level of renewal for the church. So anyway, just coming back to Dan and this book. So Dan's the founder of the Avila Institute, and then also they have a community called the Apostolic VA, which is where there are different levels of membership, where people are committed to prayer and the spiritual life. And I can put a link up into the group so that you can have a look at them, for spiritual formation and be part of their community of prayer and study and fellowship. And there's a particular logo on, charism that they have, very much steeped in the Carmelite spirituality, very much steeped in the Ignatian spirituality and deeply Eucharistic. And I would say also very much influenced by Dominican spirituality, since Dominican spirituality in many ways have influenced the Carmelites, and I would say even some of Father Ignatius of Loyola, St. Ignatius of Loyola. Okay, so coming back to Dan, just in the introduction to his book, he speaks about out of darkness. He's talking about this path of discernment that he learned to come out of his own chaos and anguish. He speaks about it in the introduction. Well, first of all, he quotes 1 Peter. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, that you may declare the wonderful deeds of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So out of darkness into the marvelous light. So he says that, he came to know Jesus. He came to know faith. You should look up his testimony on YouTube. It's wonderful. But, out of the darkness of his youth, out of the torture and anguish of his own past, he came to know the Lord. But he said that even after coming to know the Lord, it took a much longer process to really know this peace of Jesus Christ, the peace that he promises. And he says this was more of an elusive process. But then he paints a picture in the introduction of the kind of life that he had, and that he did reach peace. And if he reached it, he says, well, anybody can reach it, because what he came out of was a complete battle zone. And so it gives us hope to know that. So for example, you know, he speaks about just an episode in his life. He's like, screaming rage, another full volume, frightening argument, and then boom, dead silence. A gunshot. I was only 9, but I knew what it was. My 2 younger brothers and I huddled at the bedroom of the stairs, frozen with terror in the eternal silence. Was my mother dead? Would he kill us next? I couldn't move or run or think. It seemed like an eternity before we discovered what had happened, although we never really learned the full story. And he just gives us a little snippet from his life where he says, you know, there are times of wailing, crying, hysterical, and just out of this anguish and being tormented by these memories because it marks you, he learned to find the Prince of Peace.